won't keep you waiting any longer because I know you're all very excited to get this started. Yeah, I'm very happy here to present Austin Smith. He is I believe now 6th year. Going into 6th year. PhD student at University of Alaska Fairbanks in the Geophysical Institute. He's jointly advised by Peter Delamere and Doachan Osterk, and he's going to talk to us about cool Jupiter facts. So please take it away.
And I think I'll just sit here, so it'll be kind of a chill seminar. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about the three-dimensional structure of Jupiter's magnetosphere, and also talk about the ionosphere as well, with both models and observations. And I'd also just like to thank those who were organizing this seminar series for inviting me to come here and speak on this. Thank you for the opportunity. And this project has been going on for quite a while, and it's not just me. There's a large group at UAF who's been working on this stuff, group at University of Hong Kong, and CGS and APL. Without their help, a lot of this stuff wouldn't have been able to be shown. And also a decent group at LASP has been helping with the data analysis and comparison. So it's not just me, it's a big group working on this. So first, an outline of what I'll be talking about. Since I know most people here are probably familiar with more of the Earth or the Sun, I'm going to give an outline of Jupiter's magnetosphere and the Juno mission. And then I'll talk about the models that I use. And then after the introduction, move towards the equatorial magnetosphere, talk about what I see in the observations and the models there, then move outside of the equator plane, mainly sticking to the dawn side of the magnetosphere, and then touch on the ionosphere, and then discuss ongoing work and open it up for questions at the end. And there's basically 2 papers being presented in this presentation. There's a paper that's currently under review, which I discussed there, the equatorial magnetosphere, briefly touch on the outside the equator plane, and then also focus on the ionosphere. And another paper last year was published in AGU Advances that I was part of, which mainly focuses on the magnetic topology outside the equator plane of Jupiter. And want to give some overview for the motivations and goals of this whole project. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to provide global context for the observations at Jupiter, and understand kind of Jupiter's magnetosphere through the modeling perspective. Also want to compare to and learn from the more well understood geospace and solar environments. So kind of the comparative magnetosphere aspect there. As far as kind of the science questions we're looking at is, where is the open magnetic flux in Jupiter's magnetosphere? And by open, I mean, one side of a field line is connected to the planet and one side is connected to the solar wind, and how we can determine where these open field lines are with the available observations, because you can't do field line tracing with a single spacecraft or even multiple spacecraft. And then also think about how the magnetic topology manifests itself in the auroral observations. And another part is trying to understand the role of the ionospheric Pedersen conductance in Jupiter-like magnetospheres. Specifically, how does the average Pedersen conductance influence dawn-dusk asymmetries in the magnetosphere, and what the effects of the ionospheric Pedersen conductance are on the polar region's magnetic topology and dynamics. And also, and this is a broader question, which I'm still thinking a lot about, is how does the Pedersen conductance control mass transport and magnetic flux circulation in a giant magnetosphere? And another goal for this talk is try not to get a headache, because there's some of these things we're flying all around the Jupiter system, and can get a little confusing sometimes. I get confused all the time. So try not to get a headache. Okay, so we're going to start with Jupiter's magnetosphere now. So some kind of big picture background is Jupiter has internal plasma sources. continuous plasma sources. This is unlike the Earth. There's volcanism on the moon Io and cryovolcanism on Europa. Io, though, represents a majority of the internal plasma, about 1,000 kilograms per second of plasma, whereas Europa is more in the order of 50 kilograms per second. And this basically results in a inflated magnetosphere. So the subsolar magnetopause boundary is further out than you would expect because there's this internal thermal plasma pressure coming from this internal plasma source. And these are also heavy ions too. From Io, it's mainly sulfur and oxygen products from sulfur dioxide. And from Europa, it's water group ions. And these are mainly confined to the equatorial plane in the system because of, well, we'll talk about Jupiter's fast rotation speed, but that basically results in high centrifugal forces in the non-inertial reference frame, which confine these heavy ions to the equator plane. There's also the complex magnetic field. So the magnetic field at Jupiter is stronger than Earth's. At the surface and the equator, it's about 10 times that of Earth's. And there's also a high quadrupole moment in the northern hemisphere, which makes the auroral distribution there a bit more complicated, which we'll see some of the aurora later on. And kind of similar to Earth, there's a 10-degree dipole tilt, so the dipole is offset from the rotation axis. Jupiter, though, doesn't really have the same seasons as Earth. There's not so much that tilt. So this here is kind of a schematic of Jupiter's magnetosphere. I mean, everyone's seen this for Earth, but it's a bit more complicated. There's the dawn side closed flux loop, and here in the current sheet, this basically because of the fast rotation speed, it forms a structure called the magnetodisk. So the magnetic fields are stretched into this disk shaped structure. And yeah, so Jupiter has a very fast rotation period. It's 11 times larger in radius than the Earth, and has a 10-hour rotation period. So the magnetosphere is a co-rotationally dominated system. And you can think of the magnetic flux. At Earth, we think of the Dungy cycle, right, for the flux circulation. At Jupiter, it's the Basileus cycle. So it's mainly co-rotationally dominated, but because of that, the X-line shifts over here to the dawn side in this cartoon diagram. And you can see how the magnetodisk structure gradually stretches and stretches until plasmoids break off here on the dawn flank. The solar wind advection time is also different at Jupiter. The solar wind speed's about the same on average, but because Jupiter's magnetosphere is larger, that means it takes about 10 to 20 hours for a piece of the solar wind to advect over the main part of the magnetosphere. At Earth, I mean, it changes based off of your solar wind speed, but it's about 20 minutes. So having something like also Jupiter's dipole is flipped compared to Earth, so northward IMF at Jupiter to try to get a Dungy cycle going is not statistically likely. So this means that Jupiter is mainly an internally driven system. There is some solar wind influence, but it's mainly driven by dynamics inside the magnetosphere. And there's also sub and super alphanic regions inside the magnetosphere, which is kind of complicated. It means that in the inner region where there's the moons, they are connected in the subalphanic region to the planet. You get alphane wings, and there's spots in the ionosphere that correspond to flux tubes that map to where the moons are at. And beyond this, there's this planetary wind. So this is a superalphanic region where plasma is no longer connected to the planet, and it just kind of like the solar wind blows down the tail. So talking now about the Juno mission, well, in observations in general, there's 9 total missions that have flown to Jupiter with 2 dedicated orbiters, Galileo and Juno. And Juno, by far, has provided the most comprehensive view of the Jupiter system. And there's also 2 more orbiters en route, JUICE and Europa Clipper, so it's kind of a nice, exciting time to study Jupiter, and there will be multi-point measurements at Jupiter, which will be really cool. But Juno is a polar orbiting spacecraft. So here is the magnetic equatorial plane, and you can see different orbits. 5 is in black, and the orbit is gradually precessing so that the perigove is going to sit above the northern hemisphere of the planet. And the perigove is now basically directly below the planet. And there's also a precession in local time. 5 was the insertion orbit where data was starting to get collected, and it's now somewhere between noon and dusk. So it's also sampled a lot of local time as well. And there's also several Earth-based data sets. There's the Hubble Space Telescope, James Webb, and Saki. So those are kind of near Earth telescopes. And there's also ground-based observations like the Keck Observatory, which have provided a lot of remote sensing opportunities at Jupiter. For the equatorial observations that I'm presenting today, I'm presenting some of the Galileo Plasma Suite instrument results, as well as Juno Jade observations from these 2 papers, one which covers mainly the dawn to midnight side, and one which covers the entire night side. And also comparing to some empirical profiles from Galileo and Voyager. And then for the off-equatorial observations, I'm looking at Juno Jade and Juno Jedi. Jade is the thermal energy range plasma instrument, and Jedi is the energetic particle instrument on the Juno spacecraft. So as far as the ionosphere of Jupiter goes, kind of even less is known about it compared to the magnetosphere. Only recently, in like the last 3 months, there was high latitude radial occultations of Jupiter's ionosphere. And because Jupiter is sitting at 5 AU, solar illumination doesn't play as big of a role. So for the ionosphere conductance, solar UV radiation doesn't contribute that much. And there's this range of values in the literature for conductance. This is mainly based off of other models or energetic particle precipitation based models of what the conductance could be in the ionosphere. And they range from 0.05 mil all the way up to about 10 mil. So it's this pretty broad range of conductance. Hall conductance at Jupiter is less important, especially for the large-scale magnetosphere-ionosphere coupling. It's estimated to be about an order of magnitude smaller than the Pedersen conductance, so it's often neglected, and I am also neglecting it in my models, but hope to add it in the future. And yeah, as I mentioned, there's these new Juno occultations. There's 4 right now, which in the auroral region have shown a conductance range of about 1 to 5 mil. Although it's highly variable and also highly variable in altitude. I think it's about 1,000 kilometers between peaks in the electron density. So it's kind of crazy what's going on up there. Okay, so that was the overview of Jupiter's magnetosphere and Juno. Getting into the model description now. So I'm using the grid agnostic magnetohydrodynamics for extended research applications code GAMERA. It's part of the MAGE framework at APL. And it's this global scale numerical MHD model. It's an updated version of LFM, and it's been used to study multiple magnetospheres in the solar system, Earth, which many of you may be familiar with. It's also been used to study Jupiter. This is kind of in the Jupiter community, the picture that everyone puts up when there's Jupiter magnetosphere modeling from Beijing in 2021. And then also Saturn, which there's a couple of publications that are in under review right now for Saturn. My ionospheric results are coming from REMIX, which is the redeveloped ionosphere magnetosphere coupler and solver. It's an updated version of MIX. It's a 2D ionosphere model that's coupled to GAMERA. Now, the grid, I've spent a lot of time playing with the grid for Jupiter because there is some grid sensitivity. This here is an example of a quad scale grid. If people are familiar with MAGE, there's different levels of resolution. And this is a non-orthogonal grid designed for magnetospheres. So you can see here there's some higher resolution near where boundary layers are formed. The domain that I'm actually using is quite large, especially when you consider Earth. The sunward boundary is at 160 RJ, the tailward boundary is over 1700 RJ down the tail, and plus or minus 500 RJ in the direction perpendicular to the Jupiter-Sun axis. The inner boundary is also set at 4. For example, Io, the innermost major Galilean moon of Jupiter, orbits at about 5 RJ. And I'm also using this hybrid quad oct resolution because there's these strong radial density gradients from the internal plasma source. And in order to better resolve those while saving on costs, computational costs, basically have just doubled, so made a quad grid oct in the radial direction because it's not orthogonal, it's not quite radial. But that has been a nice way to basically better resolve those radial gradients. And the remix grid, it's mainly focused on the polar cap in the polar region. It goes to a limit of 30 degrees co-latitude and it has a pretty nice resolution, but I haven't done a calculation. I don't know what 1 degree by 0.83 degree at Jupiter looks like. It might be, you know, the size of like North America for each degree. But it's nice enough for what I'm doing now. Also, we'll be moving around a lot. There's this nice arrow here where I have a plot showing where the sun is, and the sun will move around a lot. Sorry, people have preferences on which way the sun points, and sometimes I have to cave and sometimes I have my preference. So it's a bit messy. This is an MHD model, so there's no kinetic scale physics. And the current MHD results for Jupiter are basically valid beyond 10 RJ. Inside of 10 RJ, it's a diffusive radial transport. Outside of 10 RJ, it's advective at Jupiter. So we're basically only considering MHD results beyond 10 RJ. And in the future, we could interpret kinetic scale effects using test particle runs, but haven't looked too much into that yet. There's also no radiation belt physics, and we're currently using only a single fluid in the model. We also have a spin-aligned dipole, which means that all the comparisons with observations are going to be in magnetic coordinates, as a way to make it more simple. And we're also using a constant solar wind. There's no upstream solar wind monitor at Jupiter, so we don't even know kind of what's happening. Sometimes Juno does pass into the solar wind, so we get a picture of what the solar wind is doing. But we're focusing on mainly average magnetospherically driven behaviors, so using the average solar wind conditions is appropriate. For the ionosphere, right, I'm only using constant Pedersen conductance, no Hall conductance, and there's no gradients in the conductance as well. There's no thermospheric contributions, which at Jupiter may play a big role. We don't really know in the high latitudes, but deeper in the atmosphere, there's lots of storm systems. So there could be effects from the lower atmosphere that play a big role in the ionosphere at Jupiter. For the eogenic mass loading, this is currently implemented in a broad region inside of 10 RJ, where we're not really looking, and it's implemented in such a way that the average mass transport rate to the sheet, the current sheet, magneto disk, is within the range suggested by observations, between 200 and 600 kilograms per second. And this is for non-volcanically active periods, because if there's a volcano erupting, then there's more material and changes the mass loading rate quite a bit. And for these runs, there's a spin-up time of about 900 hours, which is effectively the refilling rate of the Io plasma torus. And then the analysis window is from 900 to 1,000 hours, which is 10 rotation periods of Jupiter. And for some of these plots, you'll see I'm running a numerical experiment where I've set the different Pedersen conductance values to 0.5, 1, 5, 10, and a million mil. A million mil is the limiting case of basically infinite conductance, and it's enforcing rigid co-rotation. It's been used by simulations in the past, including the simulation in the 2024 paper that there's some results. So we'll see how that case kind of works out. Although the two simulations are different, slightly. Okay, so now moving into the equatorial plane, these are radial profiles. So this is kind of the metric that people use to validate their models at Jupiter. These radial profiles are in the tail from observations. In orange is the Galileo observations. In red and black are the Juno Jade observations. And the dotted dashed line is the empirical profile from Voyager and Galileo. Now, the solid lines are the model results, 0.5, 1, 5, 10, and a million mil. And the shaded region is the interquartile range, so plus 25%, minus 25% from the median value. And this median is taken down the tail to 100 RJ within 40 RJ of the tail. And we can see that all of the model cases basically lie in this range between the Juno observations and the Galileo observations, which go out to 40 RJ. And beyond that, the 0.5 mil case is also sticking nicely to this empirical profile. So here in this case, the 0.5 mil case is comparing the best with the observations. Now, because Jupiter is a primarily co-rotationally dominated system, we care a lot about the azimuthal velocity, or the co-rotational velocity, V5. Now, here we can see that the co-rotation breakdown, the colors are the same for the different ionospheric conductance cases. The co-rotation breakdown, so the break from the rigid co-rotation line here, is ordered by the conductance, which is kind of expected. So you lower the conductance, you loosen your control on the magnetosphere, and for the 0.5 mil case, it kind of compares the best with the data and has a gradual breakdown in co-rotation between 20 and 30 RJ, whereas the higher conductance cases, the 1 and 5 mil case, kind of break around 40 or 50 RJ, and the very high conductance cases of 10 and a million mil break around the same point at about 60 RJ. So here again, the 0.5 mil case has the best comparisons with the observations. Now, temperature is a bit more complicated. But you can see in the observations, there's this increasing temperature profile here, right? Even with these observations, there's this increase. With the new observations, the empirical profile has been brought into question a lot, especially because we see this dip, whereas in an empirical profile, there's not that drop in temperature. Now, because of this increase in temperature, it's been thought that there's heating as the plasma moves radially out, right? But as the plasma from Io is transported radially out, it should be adiabatically cooling. So there's been lots of discussions about turbulent heating and stuff, but I'll touch on that at the end of this presentation. What I want people to take away from this is that the peaks in conductance, well, the peaks in temperature are ordered by conductance. So the 0.5 mil case peaks around 18 RJ, 1 mil case peaks around 32 RJ, and then so on. And the observations are in between the 0.5 and the 1 mil case. So we've kind of bracketed with a constant ionospheric Pedersen conductance where the peak in temperature is happening. Now, there's also lots of dawn-dusk asymmetries in the Jupiter system. Now, here in the upper left panel, we can see the occurrence of radial outflows and inflows in the equatorial plane And this is coming from Junjiao's forward fit data sets from 274 crossings of the magnetodisk. So, it's a great data set. It does provide a somewhat limited view of the magnetosphere, though, which you can see highlighted in red throughout all these plots. Although with this, we do see that there's this dawn-dusk asymmetry with more outflows on the dawn side, more inflows on the dusk side. And this is seen in all the model cases, especially the lower conductance cases. We see that the outflows continue for the 0.5 mil case beyond noon, and to about noon for the 1 mil case. In the higher conductance cases, it's a little more 50-50, 40-60 for outflows and inflows on the day side. But on the night side, we still see this dawn-dusk asymmetry in the tail. Now, because the asymmetry is stronger in the observations and stronger in the lower conductance cases, here also the 0.5 and 1 mil cases compare the best with the observations. Now, this plot here is showing for the different cases the average azimuthal flow, so the co-rotational flow, normalized to rigid co-rotation. So red here is super co-rotational, blue is sub-co-rotational, and white is co-rotational. And observations have shown that there's actually very little super co-rotation in the magnetosphere, and it's mainly sub-co-rotational, especially on the dusk side, which for all of these cases, there is sub-co-rotation on the dusk side. But here again, the 0.5 mil case is the most realistic. And above 1 mil, you can see that there's regions where there's on average, right? This is a 100-hour average, 10 rotation periods. There's on average super co-rotational flows between the dawn side and noon. And also here, this is the magnetosheath. And this is also kind of because as the plasma is co-rotating around, it interacts with the boundary and has to be funneled through. So it's almost like a nozzle. It has to speed up a little bit to get through the region between the magnetopods and the planet. Now, there was also a recent study from Zhang et al. 2024, which basically did a numerical experiment where they sped up Earth and they saw how the magnetospheric flows and the magnetic topology changed with rotation rate of the planet, and basically got to a very Jupiter-like situation. However, this is also kind of showing the importance of the ionospheric conductance, because you can spin your planet up faster, but if you can't communicate from the ionosphere to your magnetosphere, then it doesn't matter if your planet's spinning faster, right? Because you have that lag in communication. So this is kind of showing that both the conductance and the rotation rate are very fundamental parameters for your magnetospheric flows and your magnetic topology. Okay, so now we're going to look outside the equator plane. So showed this figure before. Sun's over here, Jupiter's here. The red field lines are being traced from this circle in the ionosphere. The green field lines are being traced from here, which actually connect to the IMF, so they're open. The blue field lines trace all the way down the tail, so they're considered open. But then in the high latitude, there's this black region of closed flux. And this is a model, right? So the question is, where do we see this in the data? Like, how do we test this in the observations? So what we did is we looked at, on the dawn side from orbits 5 to 23, the average azimuthal flows from all these orbits. And so this is the magnetic equatorial plane here again. And you can see there's this region of anti-co-rotation. So this is V5. Red is in the co-rotational direction, blue is in the anti-co-rotational direction. And in the model, we did a 2 rotation period average at 3 local time. And because in the model, you can trace the field lines instantaneously, we can see here in yellow is the magnetodisk, which is closed, 100% closed. And then there's this region of open field lines in between this very high latitude closed structure. And that is that closed Donside region, just because this is a slice. And in this open region, we see in the model reduced co-rotational flows. And we didn't just look at the flows in the data, we also looked at the Jedi composition ratio. So this is the ratio between helium and hydrogen. The hydrogen is mainly coming from Jupiter, it's a big ball of hydrogen, although also from the solar wind. The helium is mainly coming just from the solar wind. So, the more helium there is, the more solar wind material there is. And we see where these open field lines are in the model roughly corresponds to where this transition happens between co-rotational and anti-co-rotational flows and non-solar wind material to solar wind material. So the solar wind is getting in there at roughly the same spot that we see this transition from closed field lines to open field lines. So this is kind of very much suggesting that there is this open field line region above the magnetodisk, and we'll see in the auroral observations that in the extreme high latitudes, it's likely closed just from the auroral observations, which we also see in the model. And, this was an average. This is, let's see, this is a very dynamic system. So on the left here, this is density at 3 local time, and this is the flows again. And the hatch regions are showing where the closed magnetic flux is. And if there's no hatches like here, that is open magnetic flux. So you can see the field topology is very dynamic. And sometimes you have here, there's very high density on open field lines right next to low density on closed field lines, and it changes. And here you can see that there are instances of anti-co-rotational flow in the model. Just on average, it appears as reduced. Yeah, so there's some regions of anti-co-rotational flow. So there's a lot of dynamics happening too.
Positive is with the co-rotation.
Yes, positive red is with co-rotation. So here, looking at the sensitivity to the ionospheric conductance. So, because laser pointer doesn't work on the video, this is the lowest conductance case, the 0.515, the high conductance cases. And you can see in the lowest conductance case, it's almost constantly, and this is now also the dawn-dusk meridian. So not just a 3 local time slice. There's lowest conductance, almost constant anti-co-rotation. Here in the 1 mil case, it's pretty consistently anti-co-rotation, but in the higher conductance cases, it's just reduced. Although there are instances where there is anti-co-rotational flow in the higher conductance cases. So for the lower conductance cases, we see that there's more solar wind influence in the system and also more open magnetic flux, as well as more anti-co-rotational flows. And on the dusk side, we see that there's also reduced co-rotational flows because it's kind of spreading out and slowing down. It doesn't have to fit through the boundary between the planet and the magnetopods. So now moving on to the ionosphere. So as far as MI coupling, a lot of people think of field line currents, but at Jupiter, there's actually fairly limited cases of field line currents observations, and this is because it's very difficult to tease out from the magnetic field instrument, because the magnetic field at the pole is incredibly strong, what the field line current actually is. But with the couple of flybys, which are taken from around this region here, we have values of about 0.25 to 1 microamp per meter squared. The structure, though, of the field line currents is very different from Earth. So up here, I have some of the average field line currents at Earth from Ampere with different IMF conditions. And, at Earth, we have region 1 and region 2 currents. At Jupiter, we don't have the same structure. We have zone 1 and zone 2, very creatively named. In zone 1, we have average upward field line currents in the model, and this is where there are observed downward energetic electrons that Juno has seen. And in zone 2, which is the extreme high latitude region, this is where there's downward field line currents in the model. This is again an average picture. In the observations, it gets more complicated in zone 2. There's bidirectional acceleration, although the upward intensities are often greater than downward, so there's a net downward field line current. And then we also have these transition regions, which this is, at Earth, they're kind of located between at noon and midnight, no matter what the solar wind conditions here are. And this is because of the Dungey cycle, right? With the Vassilinia cycle, the transition regions are kind of pushed over here between noon and dusk. And this is also a very dynamic region, which I'll show in a little bit. Also at Jupiter, and actually all the other planets, we have H3+, which is kind of this bizarre species, coming from Earth. Don't really think about H3+, but H3+ is great because it has a thermal emission band, so you can do basically remote sensing in the ionosphere with this compound, which is not the major species, but it's a pretty significant minor species. So this is looking here at it's a roughly 4-hour average of H3+ emissions and the temperature, as well as you can see here, there's the main auroral oval and the Io footprint. You can see it's quite hot up here. Now, there's multiple heating mechanisms for heating H3+, and it's not fully understood. Now, at Earth, right, joule heating, especially during storms, accounts for most of the heating of the upper atmosphere, about 70%. In this case, though, because of remix, I just have a 2D ionosphere model, so there's no neutral winds, which are not well constrained at Jupiter, so don't know if they would play a major role. But we're kind of just thinking of this as the main representation of energy input from the magnetosphere into the ionosphere and thermosphere system for this comparison. There's also a lot of auroral heating that could play a significant role, although that's also not very well constrained. And at Jupiter, there's these storms in the polar regions, which means that there can be acoustic waves and gravity waves coming from below that heat the H3+. So it's, kind of a rough approximation, but we can still make some comparisons between the joule heating in the model and the observations. So we see here that there's reduced heating on the dawn side and this extended region of heating on the dusk side, which kind of see here in the H3+ observations as well. And we also see this drop. It's a little difficult on this color bar here, but there's a little drop in temperature in the extreme high latitudes in the H3+ emissions, and there's this drop in the joule heating. And this is also showing the potential electric potential contours, which you can think of as the ion flows. And this is very different from Earth because this is a co-rotationally dominated system again. So we basically have, instead of 2-cell convection, 1-cell convection. Now with the auroral observations, it's also quite a bit different from Earth. Here on the right is the Earth, and we have the auroral oval and then the dark polar region. At Jupiter, we have also a dark polar region, but we also have a lot of polar emissions poleward of the main auroral oval, and these are constant. Like, sometimes we have theta aurora at Earth, so there is aurora in the polar pack, but at Jupiter, this is a constant feature. In the model, this is showing, again, the percent of closed flux in this 100-hour average. We see that on the dawn side, there's more open magnetic flux. It extends more clearward. Although this is less apparent in the higher conductance cases, this is kind of corresponding to the dark polar region in the aurora. There's also this polar collar, which is a dark region in the auroral observations, just poleward of the main auroral oval. And we see this collar in the open flux in the lower conductance cases, and I think it's best defined in the 1 mil case. We can go back. You can see here this nice polar collar in the magnetic topology. And we also have the swirl region, which is this very active and dynamic auroral emission at Jupiter, which in the model is corresponding to the extreme high latitude closed magnetic flux. And in the 1 mil and above cases, this is more than 90% closed. And there's, lots of dynamics and periodicities seen in both observations from Hubble and James Webb. And here we can see the dynamics in the ionosphere as well. So this is every 15 minutes. So there's down to, a couple of seconds dynamics seen through JUST. But this is on the top row, the field line current, on the bottom row, the Joule heating and the potential contours. Again, the hatched regions show closed magnetic flux mapped down to the ionosphere, and the unhatched regions show open flux. So maybe a little difficult to see, but here in the 1 mil, we have this polar collar, which is very dynamic, and the extreme high latitude is also pretty dynamic. In the higher conductance cases, it's more co-rotational, so there's also a lot more dynamics in the ionosphere happening. And in all the cases, but in the higher conductance cases, it's most obvious. There's these signatures in both Joule heating and the field line currents of these ejection flows, which basically come from the dawn side and co-rotate across the day side, kind of fizzle out on the dusk side. So there's a lot more to do here, but it's kind of cool to look at it easily. See all the crazy dynamics that are happening at Jupiter. Okay, so now we'll get to ongoing work that I've been working on and thinking about for the past couple of months. So back to the temperature profile and the heating. So this model does not have turbulent heating or kinetic scale processes. So there needs to be other heating mechanisms to recreate a similar looking temperature profile to what we see in the observations. So what we see in the model is kind of this 3-step process. So on the dawn side, there's reconnection from the Basilunia cycle. There's an X line back here. And this reconnection generates hot, low density, and also low entropy flux tubes. And entropy in this case is the flux tube integrated entropy, which is the flux tube integrated pressure to the 1 over gamma. And if you are low entropy, you want to move inward. And if you're high entropy, you want to move outward. So these low entropy flux tubes inject on the dawn side. You can kind of see that happening here. And they co-rotate across the day side. And as they inject, they also adiabatically heat. Right? They're moving into a smaller region and heating up. And this is mixing with the cooler outward transporting plasma from Io. So as this mixes, it co-rotates then onto the night side, where in gray it's a little difficult to see, but this is where the observations are taken from. So it co-rotates into this region where we actually see it and reproduces similar looking temperature profiles. Also, I should have said that the blue contours here show the 0.5 per cubic centimeter density contours. So it kind of gives an idea of the density structures in the inner and middle magnetosphere, as well as the magnetoposin bow shock. So, stuff that I've been thinking of recently is, how much of the observed temperature profile can be explained by this mechanism? How much of it is turbulent heating or other kinetic scale processes, which wouldn't be captured by this model? So thinking about the energy budget during these heating events also, how much of the energy is coming from the magnetic field or flows. So trying to basically trace where this heating is coming from that we see in both the data and the model. Another thing that I've been working on is extracting synthetic Juno trajectories. And because we have a spinning line dipole, this is based off of local time ZMAG, which is the magnetic distance from the magnetic equatorial plane and the radial distance of Juno. And for this, we're using higher resolution runs and also an intermediate conductance of 0.75. The temperature profile is bracketed nicely by 0.5 in the 1 mil case, so try to do something in between. And this is an example of a synthetic Juno trajectory. And this dashed line here is the ZMAG. So here's a crossing of the equatorial plane. Here's a crossing. There's another one. In black is the data, and red is the simulated density. And you may look at this and think, oh, that's not too great. There's this massive peak here, but no peak in the data. And there's a really big peak here, but you don't capture it. Well, this is an incredibly dynamic system. If you were to fly Juno through an hour later, you might see something completely different. So what we really want to do is build an ensemble of synthetic Junos to basically determine the average conditions along Juno's trajectory. Because it is this highly variable system. I look at this and I see there's kind of the periodicities, which there's periodicities in the density in the observation as well, and some very small scale peaks as well, which I'm not sure if we will be able to capture that with an MHD model, but it's encouraging to see. And with this ensemble of synthetic Junos, if we do get a good match, then we can look at what happened and maybe try to build a case study off of that. Another thing I would like to do is implement a simple ionospheric conductance model for Jupiter. That way to get some kind of two-way feedback between the ionosphere and the magnetosphere, get something more realistic, because Jupiter does not have a constant conducting ionosphere. There's lots of dynamics going on in there. And another thing that I've spent a lot of time thinking about and discussing is the three-dimensional structure, which we kind of have viewed Jupiter through multiple different angles in multiple different planes. This here, though, is the 0.5 mil simulation case that I've been showing earlier, but ran at a higher output cadence and in a three-dimensional view. So it's there's a lot to look at here. We're looking down the tail, so in 1 point perspective, so the sun is multiple different waves. Jupiter is sitting over here. These circles are every 10 RJ. This one's 200 RJ. The inner disk is the flux tube integrated entropy. So you can see the lower entropy here, the higher entropy up here. This blue is not really low entropy, it's open field lines. So maybe a little confusing. And then also in the equatorial plane, this is the temperature profile. And there's contours of temperature at 0.01, 0.11, and 10 keV, which you can see there's some contours. The isosurfaces are of 1 keV, so that kind of shows some of the three-dimensional structure in the temperature. And then there's also two sets of field line traces. The blue is coming from right above the northern hemisphere along dawn-dusk axis. There's 80 field lines being traced from there. So, and then you can see the footprints in the equatorial plane. You can see the stretched field line configuration here on the dawn side. So yeah, this is the dawn side, the dusk side is over there. And the green field lines are being traced between 50 and 150. There's only 10 field lines being sourced. So with that, I'll play the animation now. And there's lots of dynamics happening here. You can see a hot blob moving down the tail, which New Horizons saw several hot blobs of plasma moving down Jupiter's magnetotail. And here you can see there was a reconnection event and this flux rope forming. It's maybe difficult to see, but there's hot inward moving plasma. You can also see that this hot region kind of extends out of the equatorial plane by a couple of RJ. And here's another kind of near this Vaxillinius X line in the cartoon diagram. And there's a lot of heating associated with it. So, yeah, there's a lot to think about and look at here. I discussed this with people for hours, but it kind of gives a picture of how messy Jupiter's magnetosphere is. Oh, and with that, I guess I'll open it up to questions.
So that last animation you said was in your ongoing work section?
Yes.
Is it still sort of to be, I guess, to be published or to be, maybe?
Yeah, doing a lot of thinking about it. Want to basically look at in these regions, where is the heating coming from? Is it coming from like reconnection and slow shocks, or is it coming from maybe there's thoughts because the solar wind is getting in here too. There's solar winds going this way, rotational directions this way, so there's some compression there. Maybe that's heating, causing some energy transfer.
Yeah, when I actually was speaking of the heating, so if you go back a few more slides to 71, I think it was another movie. I was curious, I think that was a model, another model.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess the same hours here, so at the very beginning, I noticed there's sort of a temperature stripe.
Yes, that temperature.
Exactly, yeah.
So
What that is, or-
this,
Yeah.
okay,
Exactly.
right there.
Yeah.
Uh,
I don't know what that is, sort of an initial state or maybe part of that.
Well,
complex
so
time.
this is kind of later in the 100-hour period. I should have cut it a little bit earlier because basically this temperature stripe, and this is also kind of why I did this three-dimensional picture, is it just disappears. So where does it go?
Yeah.
But it originates basically along a line here, and then it's co-rotating, and then it gets to the magnetopause and it moves up and out and it adiabatically cools, and that's where it kind of just disappears, but it's actually moving out of the equatorial plane. But it starts further back here. You can kind of see there's some not as hot ones that happen, but they're all kind of starting from back in here.
Okay.
Quick clarification question. You might have answered this at the beginning, and I missed it, but when you refer to like the different cases, like half mho, 1
Yeah.
mho, 10 mho, is that moles per kilometer?
No, so it's conductance, not conductivity. So it's height integrated. So a mho is, it's not mho per meter, which would be like a profile of conductance. Because it's just a 2D ionosphere.
I might have missed this. Well, I'm gonna quickly verify this and hopefully there will be to the question. This simulations, they all run at the same solar wind. There was this particular velocity and also
Yes.
PY component, is what I said, hard coded?
Yes. So
Yeah.
all of them were run with the same grid, same solar wind conditions, same mass loading. The only difference was the ionosphere conductance. Well, except for the 2024 cases, which looked at the comparisons with JEDI data. That was a slightly different setup for that run.
Gotcha.
Did I?
Yeah,
Okay.
and I guess that hopefully leads to the question, where it is, the huge dominating factor is that its rotation is really fast, there's a
Mhm.
rotation dominant in component. That you know how Earth like BZ component is really
Mhm.
important? Is BY, does, if you were to like tune that to like opposite, like, do you expect it to, do you expect to see something?
Not too much. There shouldn't be too much difference between a positive BY or a negative BY. Although, based off of the Parker spiral, should be, I think, mainly, it depends on which side of the solar wind current sheet you are, I think.
Oh, I see.
But the difference between the BY and positive BY, negative BY and positive BY is not too much. I am currently running an experiment where I've just turned off the solar wind, so that will be interesting. Well, the solar wind's still there, the IMF is gone. So there's no magnetic field in the solar wind.
I don't know.
But like at Jupiter too, and I mentioned this in the introduction, we don't really see constant negative or in Jupiter's case, positive BZ,
Right.
just because of the solar wind advection time.
Kind of in that vein, a lot of times MHD runs have to be like preconditioned, right, with some like sort of solar wind structure they send out for so many hours.
Yeah, yeah.
Starting echo. Do you do that in your runs? And if so, is it, how different is it for a Jovian case than it is for Earth?
So, I don't, because I'm using constant solar wind the whole time, I don't have a different startup solar wind compared to my, regular run solar wind. I do have a very long startup period, and that's because of the internal mass loading, which, and it's long because I have this constant rate of 1,000 kilograms a second, roughly. And that plasma is transporting outward. And in the startup, there's this big transient where you set up this really steep gradient and then suddenly it backs out. And it's not just the density profile that I'm trying to set up, but it's also the temperature profile, because when that startup transient happens, all this plasma moves out, it cools. So the magnetosphere gets really cold really fast. And then if the process here is through injection flows, you need a lot of injection flows to build that temperature profile back up. So because of that, I do have this really long startup period. What I would also like to do in the future is run maybe different solar wind compressions or that sort of thing. But I would still probably use this just constant BY startup period.
Cool. Yeah, that's a very interesting difference.
Mhm.
Of course, that is like the thing we always think about the moons, but that's a
Yeah.
thing that's sort of different for MHD.
Okay, so hopefully this question makes sense, we'll see. But, does your simulation, do they take into account like the Alpine wings that form between the, Galilean moons?
No.
Okay.
So the moons and Europa's roughly at 10. So Io's at 5, 6. I think it's 6 actually. But it's somewhere around there. So it's well inside the region that I'm not even really looking at too, because it's not effective. It's not an effective transport area. But the short answer is no. The moons aren't actually spots that move around in the simulation. I'm basically just modeling a cloud that is the neutral cloud that then sources the plasma, which is in Io's case nearly uniformly distributed azimuthally. Europa, it's more localized around where the moon is, but it's still a pretty broad region that sources the plasma. But yeah, that would be a whole other thing too, especially adding Ganymede. Ganymede would be cool because Ganymede also has magnetic field. So adding a magnetic field that moves around inside this magnetosphere would be cool, but.
Technically, Callisto has Alpine wings sometimes. And
Yeah, sometimes not. And that could be just because it's outside of this Alphane radius too. So if it's in a super Alphanic region, then it's not really communicating to the planet.
Yeah, it seemed like your last, video wasn't complicated enough, you definitely.
Yeah. Oh, I've made some more complicated ones.
Say that forever.
Yeah. Hopefully that answered your.
Right, okay. Thank you.
Just a quick clarification on that, on the subject of that visualization, the last one. What is the isosurface again? I know you studied what it
Yeah,
was.
so the isosurface is the 1 keV level, so, well, hopefully this doesn't. Oh, I can't even.
That one.
Nope. Okay, it's big enough. Yeah, so it's here's that strip of temperature that then moves up, and then cools. So it's the 1 keV isosurface. So we're looking from the solar wind, which is cold. So inside these regions are above 1 keV. So this is like a hot blob. There's a hot blob with some crazy off-equator structure. Here's a hot blob, and you can also see during this reconnection event, kind of this C-shaped region of temperature. This is with pair view and lots of great things you can do with pair view. Pair view can be kind of fun.
Any last questions?
Oh, sorry, where we talked about the field of line current, there was little 2D map showing, highlighting the regions, the zone, right? And then right after that, it was, similar kind of 2D plot, but showing the, heat, the heating.
This
Uh,
or,
yeah, so I think it's the one before this and this.
yeah, this one?
Yeah, so I'm just without, understanding too much physics, just looking at the bottom of the previous page and then looking at the kind of like the shape where it opens up to the bottom.
Here?
The top left, and then just trying to mesh the shape and that I shouldn't really think of it, because if you go to the next one, I'm just looking at that, kind of the circles in the first one, where we could see kind of a disconnecting region at the bottom. I shouldn't think about it
So
where they go like this to it. It's not.
this is also something that gets very complicated at Jupiter is this is looking at the North Pole because this is coming from the Keck Observatory, so it's on Earth. And because of Jupiter's high quadrupole movement, especially in the northern hemisphere, like here you can see it's kind of the geographic coordinates, and the pole is here, but the roll oval is way off to the side, which is great if you're sitting on Earth and you want to see it, because then you can see it as it moves by. But that makes it offset and also very difficult to compare, because this is in magnetic coordinates and this is in system 3 coordinates, which has this high quadrupole moment. And this is approximate local times too, because this is average over system 3. Does that, sorry.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's, especially in the ionosphere, it's difficult to make comparisons with the observations at Jupiter.
And give Austin their hand.
Thank you for inviting me.